In this video, we are going to talk about 10 most populous countries. Soon after 2050, the world population is expected to surpass 10 billion. Despite the fact that global population growth rates have slowed in recent decades, the world's population is not predicted to start decreasing until well into the beginning of the following century. Moreover, half of the world's population resides inside the 10 countries that have the highest population density. The demand for everything, including jobs and natural resources, will increase as the population grows. Therefore, rapid population expansion can inhibit progress. Despite this, the bulk of the countries with the most inhabitants on the planet have been successful in slowing down their rates of annual population growth. The number of people living on this planet is rapidly increasing. The world's population is now estimated to be over 7.8 billion, and several nations across the globe are witnessing extraordinary increases in their resident populations. This statistic has remained stable over the course of the past few years. Which country has the greatest number of residents? Do you want to find out which country in the world will have the greatest population in the year 2022? Here are 10 most populous countries. So let's start. Number 10. Mexico. Mexico, which has a population of around 127.6 million people, is the second most populous country in Latin America. Beginning in the late 1950s and continuing into the 1960s, the country's annual population growth remained quite consistent. However, it started to slow down in the 1970s. In 1959, the rate was 3.17%, but by 2020, it had dropped to just 1.06%. This represents a significant decrease. Although forecasts indicate that Mexico's population growth would continue to slow until the year 2050, the country will nevertheless add population throughout that time period. Number 9. Russian Federation. More than 144 million people call the country of Russia home, making it the most populous nation in all of Europe. It was estimated that Russia's annual population growth rate was 1.68% in the year 1954. This rate fell dramatically in the middle of the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, before slowly climbing back up to its previous level in the 1980s. However, not long after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia's pace of population growth began to slow again, and by 1994, the country was actually experiencing a decline in its overall population. It wasn't until 2009 that Russia's population started growing again. It reached an annual growth rate of 0.14% in 2014 before beginning to decline once more. The annual growth rate of Russia's population in 2020 was only 0.04%, and figures predict that the country will begin to see a decline in population beginning in 2025 and continuing onward. Number 8. Bangladesh. Over 163 million people call Bangladesh home at the present time. Over the past several decades, Bangladesh's population growth rate has not been stable at a consistent level. In 1951, the country experienced an annual growth rate of 2.14% in terms of its population. This rate reached its all-time high of 3.28% in 1967, then dropped to 1.52% in 1973 and 2.76% in 1979 before climbing back up to 3.28% again in 1979. Since the 1980s, Bangladesh's rate of population growth has been following a pattern that indicates it will continue to decline. The annual rate of increase of the country's population reached a new record low of 1.01% in the year 2020. It is anticipated that this rate will drop to 0.15% by the year 2050. Number 7. Nigeria. The most populated nation on the African continent is Nigeria. There are almost 200 million people that name the country in West Africa their home. The annual growth rate of Nigeria's population is actually higher currently than it was in the 1950s, which stands in stark contrast to the population growth rates of other emerging countries. The number of people living in Nigeria increased at a rate of 1.49% in the year 1951. However, by the year 2020, its population had increased by 2.58%. It is possible that Nigeria's population would double between now and 2050 if current trends continue. Number 6. Brazil. Brazil has more people living in its borders than any other country in South America. There are more than 211 million people now residing in the country. Since the 1950s, Brazil's annual growth rate has gradually slowed down, despite the fact that the country's population is constantly expanding. The population of Brazil increased at a pace of 3.02% in the year 1951. In contrast, Brazil's total population increased by only 0.72% throughout the year 2020. It is anticipated that Brazil's population will have decreased by 0.05% by the year 2050. Number 5. Pakistan. The population of Pakistan is somewhere about 216.6 million people. Its annual population growth rate continued to climb steadily up until 1982, when it reached its highest point of 3.41%. After that, Pakistan's population growth rate began, at long last, to begin a downward trend. The rate was estimated to be 2% in the year 2020. Experts in population believe that Pakistan's religious taboos, political cowardice, and general lack of education are to blame for the country's alarmingly rapid population growth. In point of fact, the country has one of the highest birth rates found anywhere outside of Africa. According to projections, even though the rate of population growth in Pakistan will continue to slow down, the total number of people living in the country will continue to increase by a significant margin. By the year 2050, there are expected to be more than 338 million people living in Pakistan. Number 4. Indonesia. The total population of Indonesia exceeds 270.6 million people. In 1967, Indonesia's population was expanding at an annual pace of 2.76%, but that number has dropped significantly since then. In the year 2020, the rate was a mere 1.07%. The annual growth rate of Indonesia's population is only expected to decrease further, with projections showing that by 2050, the country's population growth rate will be just 0.32% annually. Number 3. United States. The entire population of the United States is greater than 328 million people. In 1970, the annual rate of population growth in the United States was at its lowest point of 0.89%, having peaked at 1.76% in 1956. Throughout the decade of the 1970s and the decade of the 1980s, the rate did not vary significantly. However, during the 1990s, the annual rate of population increase skyrocketed to a record high of 1.27%. After this era, there was a fall in the first half of the 2000s, a modest resurgence in the second half of the decade, and then another decline beginning in 2009 and continuing forth. The yearly population growth rate in the United States was only 0.59% in the year 2020, and it is only predicted to get lower in the years to come, but it is projected to remain positive through the year 2050. Number 2. India. With more than 1.36 billion inhabitants, India holds the position of being the world's second most populous nation. It is believed that by the year 2027, India would have surpassed China to become the nation with the most people in its population. Since the early 1980s, the percentage of India's total population that grows by 1 year has been gradually falling. In 1982, the rate of growth in the country was 2.35%, but by 2020, that rate had dropped to just 0.99%. Recent projections have India's population at its maximum sometime in the early 2060s, if current trends continue. India, in contrast to China, has not implemented any policies that restrict the number of children its citizens are allowed to have. Instead, the slowdown in the country's population growth is attributed to factors including rising prosperity, more educational opportunities for women, and increased access to family planning services. Number 1. China. China has more people than any other nation on the planet. It is the permanent residence of close to 1.4 billion people. It was deemed illegal for families in the country to have more than one child under a policy that was implemented in 1979 and was referred to as a one-child policy. The country has taken some efforts to address overpopulation, including these measures. However, as of right now, a Chinese citizen is allowed to have a maximum of 2 kids. The percentage of China's total population that grows by 1 year has decreased by a sizable amount since the late 1980s. When compared to the growth rate of 1.94% in 1988, the growth rate of 0.39% in 2020 was significantly lower. If current demographic trends remain unchanged, China's population will begin to fall by the year 2035 at the latest. What do you think of our video? Let me know in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this video and want to hear from me again, be sure to hit that subscribe button before you go. Thanks for watching.